Hello everyone and welcome back to another reaction video. Today we are taking a look at the second part of Epic History's TV series on the Napoleonic Wars. Today we are reacting to the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon's masterpiece. And without further ado, let's go.
An Epic History TV History March collaboration, supported by our sponsor, The Great Courses Plus. In December 1804, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French. Europe had never seen such a sudden and dramatic rise to power. A son of impoverished Corsican nobility to military dictator of France in little more than 10 years.
Yes, and they are not wrong. This is one of the most extraordinary rises in at least European history, but I would say in world history too. Napoleon was not much of anybody at the start. He was a son of minor nobility, as they said, on Corsica no less, which had just been incorporated into France to begin with, so they really didn't have such a high status. We're not talking about the ancient nobility of France. So yeah, going from that and working his way through the ranks to reach this position he has in just 10 years is really breathtaking.
Revolution and war had cleared Napoleon's path to the throne. War would dominate his 10-year reign.
That it would.
A conflict unprecedented in history that would leave millions dead and a continent in turmoil. Eight months after Napoleon's coronation, the French Empire and its Spanish ally were at war with Britain.
Yes, some background. What happens right before this is that in 1802 the Treaty of Amiens is signed between France and Britain, which establishes peace in Europe for the first time in a very, very long time. And basically the treaty contains various stipulations. I won't go through them all, but many colonial possessions are traded around various nations. France agrees to withdraw from the Papal States and Naples, which they had occupied during the previous years. And Britain, in turn, agrees to withdraw from Egypt and the island of Malta. And on Malta, the Knights Hospitaller are to be restored to their traditional position there. However, pretty soon, or rather, everyone realized this treaty was not going to last for any long amount of time, and sure enough, in about 10 months or so, the treaty breaks down for various reasons. Britain does not withdraw from Malta as agreed. Napoleon launches an expedition, a failed expedition to recover Haiti, which inflames tension with Britain. They do not like this move. And in the end, there will be war between these two great powers again. Also, what has happened previously is that Napoleon has sold the Louisiana territory to America because of this failed expedition. And yeah.
Napoleon had assembled an army of 180,000 men along the Channel coast. But as long as the British Royal Navy ruled the seas, invasion was impossible. But nor could Britain challenge France on land.
So yeah, actually, Napoleon had spent all the $50 million he got from the Louisiana Purchase on assembling this Grand Army, which will be known as the Grand Army, ironically. But yeah, the invasion of Britain was a serious project, and even though it was never going to be able to happen because of the aforementioned reasons, the British Royal Navy had supremacy. But it was a serious project, and it did create a very strong army for which Napoleon could use in 1805.
And so British Prime Minister William Pitt tried to build a European coalition against Napoleon, using diplomacy and gold. Britain would prove Napoleon's most steadfast enemy, and its press delighted in relentless mockery of the French emperor. Britain and France were old rivals in Europe and overseas. But now, Pitt feared Napoleon's conquests had made France too powerful. The French emperor had to be defeated, and Europe's balance of power restored if there was ever to be lasting peace. Pitt found willing allies in Europe, among monarchs who despised Napoleon as a product of the French Revolution.
Yes, many of these monarchs, ancient monarchies, it has to be said, were really upset that this upstart minor noble could become the emperor of France, one of the greatest nations on the planet. And yeah, they couldn't really stand the idea. So Britain had no trouble finding any allies for this war, which will become known to history as the War of the Third Coalition. And as a Swede, I recognize one character in particular, Gustav IV Adolf of Sweden, who will be deposed in 1809. That's a story for another time.
And a dangerous threat to the existing order. Austria harbored the deepest grievances, having seen her influence in Germany and Italy steadily eroded by French victories.
Yes, French victories, especially those carried out by Napoleon himself in 1796 and the 1800 campaign in Italy. Both of them had eroded Austrian influence in both Germany and predominantly Italy. And Napoleon's claim to northern Italy was quite unacceptable to the Austrians, and it's virtually guaranteed that there was going to be a war between these two again.
The final straw came in May 1804, when Napoleon had also crowned himself King of Italy in Milan.
There we go.
Austria, Russia, Sweden and Naples joined Britain in an alliance known as the Third Coalition, and devised an ambitious plan for a series of joint offensives against France.
Yes, Great Britain would ensure naval dominance, but they would not contribute any land troops. And there were minor players here, like Sweden and the Kingdom of Naples, which wouldn't really contribute all that much, to be fair. The main players here are Austria and Russia, two great powers with access to a lot of soldiers.
The main attack would be made by a combined Austro-Russian army, advancing across the Rhine into France. But Napoleon got word of their plans, and reacted with typical speed and decision. He was determined to strike first, before the Allies could join forces, and ordered his army, now renamed La Grande Armée, to march to the River Rhine.
Yes, this was a typical characteristic of Napoleon, and he was extremely decisive, and most of the time that was a huge advantage because his opponents did it and delayed, while he was on the move all the time. And yeah, once Napoleon had made a decision, there was no going back. Everyone followed his word, and yeah, that will be very beneficial in the campaigns to come.
His target was the Austrian army of General Mack, which had made a premature advance against Bavaria, a French ally, and was now dangerously isolated from the other Allied armies. Napoleon ordered Marshal Murat, his famously flamboyant cavalry commander, to make feint attacks through the Black Forest.
We will hear a lot more about Marshal Murat in the future.
While the rest of his army, advancing at speed, enveloped Mack's army from the north. That summer, Napoleon's Grande Armée was at its most formidable. Well-trained, highly motivated, its regiments at full strength. What's more, it had been newly reorganized according to the corps system, later imitated by virtually every army in the world. Each corps, commanded by a marshal, was a mini-army of 15 to 30,000 soldiers, with its own infantry, cavalry, artillery, and supporting arms, such as reconnaissance, engineers, and transport.
Yes, although one should point out that the core system is not entirely a Napoleonic innovation. The concept of a core had been theorized during the 18th century, and it had been applied to some smaller degree, but it's really Napoleon who scales the system up to truly unheard of levels, and he refines the system, so it might as well be his innovation. And as you can see, it's a very complex system where every army, every corps, has its own staff, intelligence, reconnaissance, medical services, transport, and all that. It required an enormous bureaucratic operation to run this system, and that is the brilliance of his chief of staff, Marshal Berthier, who we will also talk about sometime in the future, that was able to create and maintain this system. And like they said, it will be copied by virtually every other army in the world, and that is for good reasons.
This meant each corps could march and fight for a limited time independently, allowing Napoleon to break with the old doctrine of keeping his army concentrated and advance with his corps widely dispersed. This helped to disguise his real objective and increased movement speed, because the army could advance along multiple roads and live off the land, taking its supplies from scattered villages.
Yes, and Napoleon did not like supply trains. Although the army did have some supplies, they were only distributed before a battle, because then it wouldn't be exactly, ideal to go around foraging when the enemy's around you. But otherwise, they had to forage for supplies en route, and the advance along multiple roads. This meant that Napoleon's army not only had the advantage of speed, and if you know anything about Napoleonic warfare, it's defined by speed, unheard of speed, not seen in maybe since Alexander's armies marched around in Persia several thousand years ago. So it also disguised their objective, as they said, and this system only has upsides, really. Though this system will not be able to handle the strains put on during 1812 Russian campaign, but we will save that conversation until then.
Rather than relying on slow-moving supply wagons. When the enemy's main force was located, the army could quickly concentrate for battle. This is how Napoleon's army was able to move at a speed that often surprised and disorientated his enemies. Mack didn't realize the danger he was in until it was too late. Napoleon's fast-moving corps crossed the Danube behind him and surrounded his army. Mack launched a series of poorly coordinated counterattacks, but despite some desperate fighting, the Austrians couldn't break out of the trap. Mack.
Yeah, the Ulm campaign, as it's called, is Napoleon's master of maneuver warfare at its apex, really. He has destroyed an army simply by marching. I think that is actually a quote from Napoleon. And that is exactly what he did. He marched up behind him, surrounded him, and Mack, he had no help coming, so he was doomed. He had to surrender, and yeah, it was a total disaster for the coalition forces.
hoped that Kutuzov's Russian army could arrive in time to save him, but the Russians were still 160 miles away.
Yeah, and the reason the Russian forces under Kutuzov was late was because Russia was still, at this time, applying the Julian calendar, devised by Julius Caesar, by the way, which at this time was not in phase with what the rest of Europe was using. The rest of Europe had adopted the Gregorian calendar, which is the calendar we still use today. And this meant that the Russians were 12 days behind the Gregorian calendar, or ahead. I'm not sure which one, but either way, they were 12 days late, you could say. So therefore, Kutuzov was not in time to assist Max advance into Bavaria, and it's really quite a serious oversight, I have to say.
And so, at Ulm, on the 19th of October, just 6 weeks into the war, Max surrendered his army to Napoleon. The French took nearly 60,000 Austrian prisoners, and Napoleon had struck his first devastating blow against the coalition. Russian General Mikhail Kutuzov was an experienced and wary commander, more cautious than Mack.
Yes, General Kutuzov is a character we will see many times in the future, and I would describe him as a rather lackluster general overall. He had some successes against the Ottoman Empire, but overall, not really a great general. However, his reputation in the Russian army and among Russian soldiers was excellent. He was a great morale booster, and even though he was a lackluster general, he often had subordinates he could delegate to, which, turned out more or less well in the end. But yeah, Kutuzov is really important for the Russian army, but not a great general. Certainly not capable of standing up against Napoleon.
His army was exhausted after its 900-mile march from Russia. But hearing of the Austrians' surrender at Ulm...
Can you imagine that? Marching 900 miles. It's unreal, the distances these soldiers marched. And I can't even imagine it, how it was. And this was before the time where shoes were adapted for the left and right foot. So, yeah, it was probably a terrible march for the common soldier.
And knowing he wasn't strong enough to face Napoleon alone, he immediately ordered a retreat. Napoleon pursued. The Russians fought several sharp rearguard actions, but could not save the Austrian capital, Vienna, which the French occupied on the 12th of October. Kutuzov slipped away to Olmütz in today's Czech Republic, where he was joined by reinforcements, as well as Emperor Alexander of Russia and Emperor Francis of Austria in person.
Now, at this point in the campaign, the Grande Armée is sort of strung out both logistically and strategically. So Napoleon needed a decisive battle to end the campaign right now. And to do so, he had pulled some clever tricks. For example, let me think. Yes, he feigned weakness in many ways. He sent vague messages to Austria and the other coalition leaders saying that, he would consider an armistice at this point. And, the Austrians were willing to accept it, considering that their capital had already been taken. However, at this point, Austria only makes up 1/5 of the coalition army that is going to go up against Napoleon. So it didn't really have much to say in this. It was Alexander I who was running the calling the shots rather, and he also feigned weakness by abandoning the heights at Austerlitz, the Pratzen Heights, and this further substantiated the Allies' theory that Napoleon was weak And finally, before the battle, a day before, Napoleon had asked to see a representative of the Tsar. They met, and Napoleon, in that meeting, you know, made himself out to be very weak. That he was really wanted to seek peace terms and all that. So yeah, the Allies, turns out, they swallowed the bait, and they would pay very, very dearly for it.
Napoleon was furious that Kutuzov had escaped. By now his army was also exhausted, and far from home, with winter approaching. He needed to force a decisive battle quickly. Fortunately for him, the overconfident 27-year-old Russian emperor sought the glory of battle, overriding the concerns of his veteran commander, General Kutuzov.
Yes, Alexander I, he's quite the character. He's one of the most strangest personalities in all of the Napoleonic Wars. He is how should I describe him? He's a very poor military leader. He's also a terrible diplomat. He's highly erratic. He has a irrational personality. He has a whole lot of quirks that makes him just a bad overall leader. So yeah, not ideal. And, Kutuzov, he was subordinate, so, he had to do what he had to do.
With the Allied army closing in, Napoleon ordered his corps to rapidly concentrate on a battlefield he had carefully selected, near the town of Austerlitz. Napoleon oversaw the dispositions of his army late into the night, then grabbed a few hours' sleep beside a campfire. Dawn would mark the first anniversary of his coronation as emperor, and promised a battle that would make or break his young empire.
Let us finish this war with a thunderclap. That's a great quote.
The morning of the 2nd of December 1805 was cold and bright with a heavy mist. Two armies of near equal size.
Now, I actually don't agree with these numbers by Epic History TV. I'm more inclined to believe the numbers of the scholar David G. Chandler, one of probably the creator of the most definitive work on the Napoleonic Wars. He estimates that the French had around 70,000 and that the Allies had around 85,000. And the truth is probably in the middle somewhere, but I'm inclined to believe the Allied army was slightly bigger at the very least. So yeah, that's just my 2 cents about it.
Faced each other across a 7-mile-wide battlefield. But the Allies held the high ground of the Pratzen Heights.
These are the ones Napoleon abandoned.
While French Third Corps under Marshal Davout was still marching to the battlefield. Seeing Napoleon's thinly stretched right flank, the Allies planned a large-scale attack from the Pratzen Heights to steamroller the French right.
You'd think debate was quite obvious. On this side of the battlefield, Napoleon had only allocated about 10,000 men, and he had 60,000 on the other side. It was quite overloaded in that sense, so yeah. But, like I said, they've been baited so far. All the signs of weaknesses that Napoleon has sent out has worked.
Before swinging round to envelop Napoleon's army. Little did they know, Napoleon was counting on his weak right wing luring the Allies into just such a move. Whereupon he would launch his own attack on the Pratzen Heights to cut the Allied army in half. His bold plan relied on his correct prediction of Allied movements, the speedy arrival of Davout's Third Corps on his right, and a perfectly timed counterattack.
It is a bold plan, regardless of all the feints that Napoleon has dropped. But yeah, it is a really bold plan, and it's a classical Napoleon thing to do.
The battle began around 7 a.m. as Austrian troops of General Kienmayer's advance guard clashed with French troops defending the village of Telnitz. In the face of overwhelming odds, the French fought stubbornly and bravely. But gradually, they were forced back. But the Allies, instead of carrying out their great enveloping attack, did nothing. The morning mist and the late arrival of orders had led to confusion and delay, and it was another hour before the first 3 Allied columns were on the move.
Now, this was, of course, an age before instant communication, and the amount of times that these sort of things happen is truly remarkable. Yet, despite it all, the fact that these generals can organize these massive battles across 7 miles of battlefield, it's truly astonishing that it was even possible at all.
Soon, fierce fighting erupted around Sokolnitz village and castle. Marshal Davout's corps, which had just force-marched 70 miles in 2 days, now arrived to strengthen the French right wing.
That's an extremely impressive
Around
feat.
9 a.m., his lead infantry brigade appeared suddenly through the mist and retook Telnitz, before being driven back in turn by Austrian hussars. 2 more of Davout's brigades reinforced French troops at Sokolnitz. As the mist began to clear, Napoleon saw that, as he'd hoped, the Allied left was moving off the Pratzen Heights, and he ordered Marshal Soult's 4th Corps to begin its attack. To the alarm of Allied commanders, 2 French infantry divisions, until now hidden by the mist, were suddenly seen advancing straight towards the Allied center. General Kutuzov was forced to hurriedly organize a defense of the heights, using troops of 4 column. 2 hours of bloody fighting followed. Musket fire was so rapid and furious that both sides were soon low on ammunition and turned to the bayonet. By 11 a.m., the French, with the advantage in training and discipline, had secured the heights and driven a deep wedge into the Allied position. To the north, a giant cavalry battle developed. While a Russian force from General Bagration's advance guard captured the village of Bosenitz, before it was halted by cannon fire from the Santon Hill. A decisive charge by 6 regiments of French heavy cavalry finally drove back the Allies, allowing Marshal Lannes' 5 Corps to move forward and seize Blasowitz and Krug. Now, Grand Duke Constantine, commanding the Russian Imperial Guard, led forward this last Allied reserve in a desperate bid to reclaim the Pratzen Heights. A battalion of the French 4th Line Regiment was charged down by Russian Guard cavalry, losing its Eagle standard in bloody fighting.
Now, whenever you heard the term guard units, it means the elite troops of the respective army. So the French had the Imperial Guard, Russians had Imperial Guard, and so on. So the guard units are the elite soldiers of the respective army, and often the bodyguard units of the emperor himself. Also, losing a standard, a flag basically, was the greatest humiliation a regiment could ever face. It was, it was truly not permissible to lose a standard. It was the pride symbol of the regiment. And, it was often captured as a trophy, basically. And that tells you a lot about how important these standards were. And Napoleon would amass quite a collection by the end of the wars. So yeah, don't lose your standard. That's my tip.
Napoleon, who'd moved up to the heights, sent in his own guard cavalry. In this grim melee between the elite horsemen of both armies, the French finally prevailed. Napoleon had broken the Allied centre. Now, to close the trap on the Allied left wing, still locked in heavy fighting around Sokolnitz. Around 2 p.m, Napoleon ordered 4 divisions to swing south and cut off their retreat. General Buxhowden, commanding the Allied left, only now saw the danger he was in. Attacked from 3 sides, the only escape was south. Many of his troops were forced to flee across frozen ponds.
That's not ideal.
French artillery opened fire, trying to smash the ice with their cannonballs. About 200 men and dozens of horses drowned in the freezing water. But not the many thousands of Napoleon's propaganda.
Any good ruler throughout history has always been a master propagandist. You can see this with Caesar, you can certainly see it with Napoleon. They knew how to exaggerate their victories and minimize their losses, and they knew how to publicize this information widely. And yeah, it was one of the key factors in Napoleon's rise to power. He was a super popular general before he became first consul and emperor, and yeah, this did not end when he became emperor.
The French emperor had won a brilliant victory. His army had taken more than 10,000 prisoners and captured 45 enemy standards. Thousands of dead and wounded of all sides littered the battlefield. Many...
Yes, if you can take a look at the casualty estimates here, these are crushing numbers. Truly astounding victory by Napoleon, and I also agree with the title of the video. This is his masterpiece battle. Even though Napoleon would have many great battles ahead of him, this was the most cleanest execution before and during and after. So yeah, and this is his crowning achievement, magnum opus, as we would call it.
He left untended for days. The Battle of the Three Emperors, as it became known, was a crushing blow to the Third Coalition. As Russian forces retreated back to Russia, Francis I of Austria was forced to accept a humiliating settlement with France, agreeing to pay a 40 million franc indemnity and give up more territory in exchange for peace.
Yes, the Treaty of Pressburg was quite devastating for Austria. They basically lost their entire coastline to France. And yeah, not great. And this was the first of, well, this was not actually the first. This was one of many humiliations inflicted on Austria by Napoleon before. So there's going to be more humiliations in the wars to come.
But meanwhile, news had reached Napoleon of a disastrous Franco-Spanish defeat at sea off Cape Trafalgar. British Admiral Lord Nelson, at the cost of his own life, had masterminded a victory so complete that it ensured British naval dominance, not just for the rest of the war, but for the next 100 years.
Yeah, it was a brilliant victory, to be sure. It was Nelson used very unorthodox naval tactics to win at Trafalgar. However, that last part is a bit of an overstatement. What Trafalgar really did is to confirm the naval supremacy that Britain had already established the previous century, and the gap between Britain and everyone else in terms of naval strength would only grow as the century went on. But yes, it was a very important victory on the road to complete naval supremacy.
Britain, master of the sea. Napoleon, unbeatable on land. The whale and the elephant, neither able to challenge the other in its own domain.
Yes, that is a extremely apt analogy, I guess. True. This time, and for many years to come, nobody would be able to touch Napoleon on land, but nobody could ever hope to challenge Britain's naval dominance either. So they were locked in a bit of stalemate at this point.
When William Pitt received news of Napoleon's victory at Austerlitz, he's supposed to have said, "Roll up that map of Europe. It will not be wanted these 10 years. A month later, Pitt was dead. But his warning that Europe faced another 10 years of war and upheaval was to prove prophetic. Napoleon Bonaparte was the ultimate disruptor of European history.
Yes, I agree with that statement. Anyways, that was the Battle of Austerlitz, part 2 of the Napoleonic War series. We will be continuing this soon enough. And, well, if you have anything to add, please comment down below. And otherwise, like the video. If you liked it, of course. you can dislike it too, I guess. Also, subscribe. That would be very much appreciated. Let's get this channel rolling. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.